All right, today we look into the second controversy story in Mark chapter 2. In the first one, in the prior video, Jesus gets into a controversy as he forgives sins and such. In this story, we get a slightly different story that happens in Mark chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, but it is another controversy story that's going to develop with some controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees in particular. Okay, so it happens here at Capernaum, or Capernaum. Okay, it happens here, which is on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, you can see it over there, right? That way. You can see that it's on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. It's on a major trade route between, if you followed that, you can see the red line, that major route. If you followed that all the way down, it would go to Jerusalem. And so Jesus is in a prime spot. Peter's lives there. Levi does work there. Jesus does a lot of ministry, especially at the start of his ministry in Capernaum. Okay. It's a great spot trade route as well. Anyone who travels down to Jerusalem, if they chose to take the Samaria route, would go through Samaria, just going straight down there. But also, there's black secondary routes, if you can see very closely. They would often go down and then they would cut across after the Sea of Galilee. Some people would do it before, but usually the south side is a little easier. To avoid Samaria, you go down and then cut across right there at the end, if you can see that. So this story goes like this. Then Jesus went out to the lake shore again and taught the crowds that were coming to him. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. "Follow me and be my disciple," Jesus said to him. So Levi got up and followed him. Later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. Notice that note there. Many of this kind among Jesus' followers. Continuing on. But when the teachers of the religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why do you eat with such scum?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "Healthy people do not need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they're righteous, but those who know they are sinners." Now, oftentimes when people hear this story, they're often jump straight into, I'm that sinner that Jesus called and has chosen to eat with, etc., etc. And that's true to an extent. We all kind of were sinners. But before we even continue going, we got to answer that question of who are tax collectors and why would they be hated by the Jewish people? Ultimately, tax collectors, when Rome took over a certain area, they would often offer the position of tax collecting to a local individual. In this case, it sounds as if Levi, who you probably have heard in Scripture as Matthew, most likely is kind of a Jew. He would be a Jew during this. He'd know the kind of Jewish laws and such. But he would be considered a traitor because when Rome comes in, they hire people to collect taxes. He would be a local person that would go, "Hey, I'll collect taxes for you." And one of the things you did when you collected taxes back then is you actually made your living by overcharging people. And so Matthew, or Levi here, would be overcharging the people. He would be a traitor because he'd be collecting money for the enemy. He'd be collecting it for Rome, but he's also taking more than the taxes that were required at the time. It's how he makes his living. So he would really be hated because he collected more money, he would keep the extra, and he works for Romans. He's a traitor. He's joined the enemy, so to speak. And so he would really, really be disliked. He would be a massive sinner in the eyes of the people. And so Pharisees in particular are going to think this is a major sinner here. This guy, he's betrayed us, he works for Rome, he takes extra money. This is the worst of the worst that you can get. And so we got to take that immediately to note. The other thing we gotta think about is who the Pharisees are. Now, this is a lot longer of a topic, one of which we will not go into very in depth here. But the simple kind of version of it is that they are religious leaders. They keep the Old Testament, okay, and they often will just say they missed the point. And in a later lesson, I go into kind of why and how they got to where they are with the way they view the laws. But just for now, we can say that they keep Old Testament laws and they add in some interpretation that they hold as high as the law itself. Okay. Usually they're portrayed as legalistic, but I don't like that for the Pharisees because one of their beliefs is that when Israel became righteous, the Messiah would come. I don't know about you, but like if we knew God was coming, like if Jesus' second coming came when the church was holy and without sin, I would be super strict on sin. So I understand a little bit of the Pharisees based on that view that they think the Messiah is going to return when Israel's is holy, when the Jewish people are holy. And so that I think they get a bad rep because they're seen as legalistic. But like when that's your view, you're going to pursue righteousness with everything that you are because you want to get out from under Roman thumb there. You know, you don't want to be in captivity anymore. You don't want to have someone else ruling over you, and so I understand why they're a little often portrayed as legalistic. They're strict. Okay, they miss the point of God's laws quite often. But in all of this, we should start to compare and contrast Jesus' attitude and the Pharisees' attitude towards the tax collectors and sinners. See, the Pharisees avoid tax collectors. They don't want them in their midst. They think they're dirty, unclean. Like, get rid of them. They're traitors. No one wanted to be around them. While Jesus has a little bit of a different attitude. Okay? Jesus views them very differently. And he views them as people lost, people hurting, people sick who need a healer. I mean, that's what doctors do, right? And that's why he gives that doctor kind of analogy. He gives that analogy because God's heart is for lost, hurting, broken people. Where the Pharisees, they were like, these people are too far, we don't want them, they're bad. Jesus takes a slightly different approach, which we should take a challenge from that. That should challenge us because we might have a bad attitude, right? We might have an attitude towards people that doesn't actually reflect how Christ views them. Do we view certain people as so bad we shouldn't interact with them or see them or deal with them? Should we just cast them off? That's a challenge for me and you. There are some people in my life who I've considered, I'm like, man, they're never going to come to Jesus. They just don't get it, right? They're so far away from God. But Jesus doesn't have that mentality. He goes after the sick and the hurting. Now, before we even hit fully why this is controversial, there's something that we have to talk about in their culture. See, during their time, eating and such was all honor based. It was reputation and social status. I like to use the phrase, you are who you eat with. So if you eat with the low of the lows, if you eat with sinners, if you eat with tax collectors, if you eat with that type of people, you are lowering your reputation, or that is your reputation, that you are bad, that you're not good, that you are stuck with not great people. And so we have to recognize, I like to say, you are who you eat with. And so you would go to banquets, you would try to go and eat with people who actually raised your social status. So you would want to eat with governors, you would want to eat with high social position status, you would want to eat with Pharisees, you would want to eat with the religious elite, you would want to eat with the business elite. See, when you would go to these dinner parties, you would also sit based on where your reputation was, based on your reputation, based on who you were higher than in their culture. It's all honor and status and reputation shaped. And so a meal is not just a meal. You know, when we eat, we just kind of go, we eat. It doesn't really matter who we eat with. For them, who you ate with was everything. It showed your reputation, it showed your status. If someone invited you to dinner who had a lower social status than you often wouldn't want to go. It would lower your social status. And so keep that in mind. It would be controversial because Jesus chooses a disciple. He doesn't just choose him, but he also eats with him from a disreputable profession, and he ultimately lowers his social status. He eats with people who Pharisees would never eat with. They are so bad, so wicked, you would not want to do it. And so he lowers his social status. Eating is a big deal. That is who he calls. That's who he calls during this time. And so that's part of what makes it controversial. He's putting his reputation on the line. Jesus puts his reputation on the line, and the Pharisees don't get it. They don't understand it, which ultimately I think can challenge us in a few ways. See, who are you? Oh, sorry, here we go. Who are you hanging out with? That becomes one of the first things that we can talk about. Jesus had the option. He could hang out with the Pharisees, the religious elite. Who's he hanging out with? And ultimately, he hangs out with sinners. Now, here's an important note. He hangs out with the sinners, though, not while they're doing bad, sinful things. Sometimes Christians use this and they're like, oh, I'm going to go reach people who are massive sinners. And like they reach them while doing really bad things. And it's like, hey, you shouldn't be with the sinner when they're sinning, so to speak. Okay? But you should be analyzing, who are you hanging out with? Are you hanging out with people because it's for your benefit? Or are you trying to reach people who also can maybe benefit from you and your insights and your thoughts and such? But are you more concerned about your reputation than you are about the lost? Are you concerned certain people will see you hanging out with someone or see you talking to someone and it's going to lower your status? Like if you're a student, if you stop playing that sport to go hang out with theater kids, or you're a theater kid trying to hang out with the jocks, right? Are you afraid to do that because of your social status? Are you afraid you'll lose your friend group? Because that's not good. We should take a step out. And lastly, those first two challenges are kind of making it sound like you're more Jesus, but in reality, you and I are the sinner Jesus eats with. And so, in what ways are you sinning? In what ways are you struggling? In what ways do you still need to work things out? Because we all have something in our life that we need to work through and create a plan to develop that one area this week. Okay? Develop plan. If you don't make a plan, it's not going to happen. So plan something specific. Something that you're struggling with. If you need to grow in patience and kindness, if you're losing your temper lately, if you're cursing, develop a plan to grow in that area this week. And so Jesus is ultimately controversial just because he eats with sinners, he eats with tax collectors, he lowers his social status when no one was willing to do it during that day and that age. And we should challenge ourselves to step out, meet new people, reach people for Jesus, and in all of it, continue to refine ourselves and grow into who Christ has called us to be. I'll see you next time for another controversy through the Gospel of Mark.